and being welcoming to people who want to try. And that is actually extremely effective. The urges that made fantasy in the general sense possible throughout the ages of humanity are still present in all of us, particularly because they're far more tied in with real world tensions and frustrations and worries than we think. Fantasy isn't an escape, it is an expression about your life. So it is critical, I think, to recognize that you absolutely can promote the activity and even work on anything you feel like doing creatively, or shall we say, okay, creatively is the activity itself. Think of a musician who also likes to make musical instruments, right? Then if you want to be doing that, you can. Now, how do you turn this into any kind of monetized thing? Well, you find the thing that you can live with. You can look at yourself in the mirror and say, well, I can accept being paid for that. For me, I can accept being paid in the sense of reimbursement with a little more to be able to keep going in terms of publishing text. But I can't look at myself in the mirror for more than that for a game text.
Yeah. What comes up a lot in the interviews that I've done is definitely this sense of being able to express themselves creatively. I follow you absolutely, like 100%, when you're describing this idea that when you're indoctrinated with a system or you're forced to conform, your actual ability to express yourself creatively is diminished. It's constrained. And yet people frequently feel like it's not. They feel like they've been given this unbounded potential.
Now, because the unbounded potential is actually there. But who stays? Think that you're only, when people are staying and then telling you how much fun they're having, you're dealing with a very small group of people. And not only that, but I don't believe them. I've had too much contact with people behaving like they're in abusive relationships and saying, well, he's getting better, or it's fun sometimes.
Referring to the tabletop role-playing game.
Or I just like being with my friends.
Yeah.
In which case I'm asked, then why aren't you doing something fun with those friends?
Right.
And or things along the lines of, well, yeah, we know, but he really loves it. We can't stop playing because it's his campaign. Basically, no, you're not going to let Josh Whedon down. This is his last chance to be Josh Whedon, and you're not going to let him down. So basically, you're humoring him. Or the person in question is a bit of a bully and everybody there is emotionally subordinated, or more accurately, they're codependent with someone else who plays a character, and the pair of them create a bullying environment toward everybody else. All very much in the sense of for the sake of the game. So and all this is very common.
Yeah. And is this a trend that you've observed mostly recently, or is this?
No, this actually socked itself into the tables during the 80s and was institutionalized during the 90s.
Okay.
Via the texts.
I see.
And so it's very strong. This is why I became much more of an activist about these things, is basically to strike back and say, no, this is what I do, and I'm going to be loud about it. And so people conflating that with specific systems, like there's indie systems versus trad systems, all that is bullshit. I mean, utter bullshit. Which is why you can go to Adept Play and see me playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition and having a fine time. Even though I'm highly critical of the system and have a whole bunch of reflections about it, about things that surprised me about how good they were, and things that I was like, oh man, this is really broken. Stuff like that. But the point is that we can in fact play because we're players. If you are a musician, you can make music with a stick and a rock.
Yeah.
You might not want to. You might want a good instrument, or more accurately, the instrument that you like. But you can do it.
The instrument that makes you play the way that you want to play.
Yeah, the things where you can do the things you want. And if without being too lit crit about it, where you say what you want, express what you want, right? Yeah. Which doesn't necessarily mean freedom to say anything during play. Constraint is an extraordinarily important part of any role-playing system, where you are forced into positions of decision making that you didn't expect or might not even want in the moment. That's actually important. So there's a lot more to go into about that stuff systemically. To get back to some of your points, or your stated, desires to talk about these things, basically, in regard to things like open game licensing, we should recognize that we don't need any such thing. The default is open. The idea that somebody says, I accord with the GNU or something like that, I'm saying, why the hell are you doing that? You should be doing it without that.
Yeah.
You can design the rules you want. You can put out text that you want, but more importantly, you can play as you want.
I want to push back just a little bit on that. I think actually, I'm following you when it comes to play, but I think one of the reasons why open licenses exist is so that somebody else doesn't copyright it.
Well, let's see. So you have put out X, Y, and Z, and you say this is under the GNU or whatever, and now somebody else can come along and use pieces of that or whatever, or even blocks of text in certain amounts for their thing. Now, what stopped them from doing most of that anyway?
As in, if the GNU license didn't exist?
Yeah.
Nothing.
Right. Nothing stopped. And not only that, but if they do overstep in terms of copyright law, then you should go after them. You didn't need a GNU or a lack of one to do it.
But if you haven't put anything, if you haven't announced it in any way, they have, this is going to be something that you would argue.
This is moving into the realms of theoreticals that I'm not sure I even can envision.
Okay.
A person has made a text available, you're saying.
Yeah.
So it is out there. So you can't say you didn't put it out there. You did put it out there. So there it is.
I see. Yeah.
I mean, somebody comes along and puts their name on it, and you say, excuse me, but here's my thing.
You can't make money off of that. And then they say, well, you never told me not to.
And I say, this is a letter from a lawyer.
Okay.
Because remember, nobody who's literally acting in bad faith is going to obey any rule you say anyway. Right? I mean, nobody if their goal is genuinely theft, they're going to do it until they're made to stop, if they are ever made to stop. They're just going to do it. I don't care what you do.
Following this trend, I mean, I've dived into the idea of open licenses from like a legal perspective as well, and you're totally correct. Like, there's really no like functional reason why they exist, at least in this case. So it's more about the conceptual side of things then. It's more about like how it's understood by people rather than what it actually does or doesn't do. Instead of saying
that's a big mountain to climb. That's a big mountain to climb. That's like saying, if you'll excuse the trenchant politics of the day, that's like turning and saying, people under occupation, if you're going to quote international law at me for any reason, then you need to accept the part of international law that says people under occupation can resist by any means. Any means. So quit whining. If you're under occupation, you can resist by any means. And that's enshrined in God knows how many statutes of the United Nations, Geneva Conventions, and even in UK law, for that matter. I don't know if you knew that. And so it is. And so therefore, but how am I going to climb the mountain of, propagandized and extraordinarily dishonest media reporting and, how am I going to fight? How am I going to climb that mountain? And the answer is no. I can deal with what I do with the people around me, people I'm in contact with, and anybody who's interested in listening to me. But I am not going to forge out there into the night. Right. I mean, I've done it to a certain extent. in from 2005-ish, 2006-ish, through, no, 2007. Okay, sorry, I'm quibbling. 2007 through 2014, which is when I ceased which is when I left academia. I was the faculty advisor for the local chapter of the Students for Justice in Palestine. And I went and I was active on the various websites, and I was, I worked hard on this, fought very hard. I'm not saying I achieved nothing. I am saying that I know what it's like to attack the mountain.
Yeah.
And the question is, how much of a hero are you planning on being for the rest of your life? Or were we just talking about enjoying play and making games when you felt like it? I'm not out here. I mean, again and again, ever since founding the Forge and all the rest of it, so many people have thought that my goal was to save the hobby. We have to convince all the role players out there. We have to, restructure the industry. We have to do, my whole thing was, no, I just want to demolish the 3-tier system so that the rest of us actually have a chance to find each other's games. It's already dying. I'm just pointing out that it's dying. Yeah. I'm not even like knocking it down, like I said earlier, so much as just putting my shoulder to it while it's already leaning. So, so I'll do that. But I'm not here to fix your friends. And I have people who've been very supportive of what I'm doing over the years and even decades. And some of them just cannot get it through their heads that my goal is not to fix the people that they shouldn't be role playing with anyway, because those people don't want to role play. They don't want to do this thing. They like being at the table. They like pushing people around. They like being experts. But they don't actually want to do the thing, because I've sat at the table with that very person, with you, and that person did not play once. They never reincorporated anything that anyone else said, and only responded to what the game master said when they absolutely had to. And everything else was just quibbling and dominating. And no, they weren't there to play. I play with a lot of people who are very assertive at the table and even over enthusiastically kind of, pushy, but they play. But when you see somebody, there's a lot of people out there who the people I interact with would desperately want to finally have fun with them. And it's not my problem. And I don't think it's their problem. And so it's been, and the trouble is that they're contagious. They'll sort of suck you back, right? And so, and you'll find yourself having meaningless arguments and meaningless debates and trying to convince them of something, and all they're just making you dance. So really, there's no point at all whatsoever to be, involved with people who aren't doing. Think of it again from a musician's point of view, or martial arts point of view, or a scientist's point of view. You are simply not going to participate with people who aren't there to do the thing. You're just not.
Yeah.
And so I take it very much in line of those things. I think the parallel is exact in all cases. And so I think that with so what do you say, what does one do? And the answer is learn to be open to the existence of the people around you who might be interested in doing the thing. And you may be surprised at how many there are. And you may even, like I have, found a venue in which this can be maximized, which in my case is the cultural scene here in Sweden, which is very active. And I think that there's room. I mean, we don't really know. In a way, the activity took an incredible body blow in the early 80s due to not the Satanic Panic, which would never have had any traction without that earlier body blow of being, destroyed, the subculture in general, the counterculture in general being economically destroyed. and extract it out. You know, the Marvel Comics, which was of the mainstream comics, the most radical and psychedelic and drug drenched and political, comics out there in the mid 70s. By the early 80s, that was all gone, all
Yeah.
gone. Right.
Mm-hmm.
The very few examples just put into very encapsulated and dubious forms.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I think that we already took the big body blow. I've told people in interviews over the years, I am not sure I'm happy to have lived to watch role playing finally get co-opted.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But if it does, I at least am not going to let it be jazz and be wholly co-opted. I am going to be a troublemaker doing it.
And anyway. I respect your position when it comes to, saying that it's not your job to fix it or to unco-opt it or something like that.
That doesn't mean I'm not going to fight in my own sphere.
No, of course. But to say that you are going to be the champion that's going to liberate everybody from this yoke of
especially all the people who buy into it harder than, who buy in. I mean, I can't liberate the people who are there voluntarily, right?
No, of course not. Yeah. I'm merely interested in your perspective on the mechanisms that perpetuate this kind of thing or further it.
Well, I do think that we've touched on a couple of those, and one of them is it took a decade or two, but entities like Hasbro have figured out how to internet for their purpose.
Right. Yes, they have.
Yeah,
they have. Yeah,
and they also, I mean, look at what they did with the OSR. The alleged OSR, which is a phenomenon of its own, but the whole old school movement thing. I mean, if you look at the rules of 5th edition, they're really not very different from the 4th edition rules in terms of the nuts and bolts of play. The larger aesthetics of play, they're quite different, but the basically nuts and bolts of the rules. But they made a big deal about how they're junking the failed rules and they're going to be all old school. They co-opted the most obnoxious and vicious trolls of the OSR to be their spokespeople. And then after one or two, printings, they jettisoned their names. They basically made sure that they got the camels into the tent long enough so that they didn't have to worry about, wait, that's the wrong metaphor. Sorry. You don't want the camels in the tent. What you want is to do what Lyndon B. Johnson said about J. Edgar Hoover, which is when he was questioned as to why, he was letting Hoover into his policymaking. He said it's better to have him inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. And so, therefore, it's the same thing with people like Zach Smith and John Tarnowski and a number of other bad actors on the internet at the time that 5th edition was published. They brought them into the tent and said, we're so old school, and danced around making old school noises. And then as soon as they didn't need this, and so when they got those people in a position where they couldn't, attack them, then they were done. They're like, okay, fuck you. And that's it. Now, granted, I'm, anyone who says fuck you to Zach Smith is fine by me. But the point is that the Hasbro knew what to do with internet opinion makers at that point. You co-opt the worst of them long enough so that they can no longer, make book off of rebelling against you.
Yeah. So another kind of pillar of this that seems to be converging in my research is paradoxically what is essentially a bad system, a system that is designed to be not. Sorry, go ahead.
Totally, but this is actually just recapitulating what happened in the 90s, which is when you would pick up something like, Legend of the Five Rings, which looks as though someone started to write a role-playing game. And then you realize, or Deadlands even more so, you pick up and you realize that they didn't even bother starting. It's just a bunch of weird, pseudo clever little tropes that they've thrown together so that it looks like a role-playing game.
Right.
Probably the example that precedes both of these and which served as the model for almost all of them throughout the 90s is Shadowrun. And you'll note that Shadowrun, even through its first few editions, keeps changing its mind on how to play. Right? The Shadowrun fans all like fight edition wars because all editions are so different. There wasn't a Shadowrun. It was just throwing spaghetti at the wall every single time, as far as play processes are concerned.
Yeah.
And again, how did you play Shadowrun? You bought the adventure supplement and you ran them through it and followed the plot. That's what you did. So remember, people selling 5th edition are not promoting the medium. They don't want people promoting the medium. This is just another way for people to play a digital computer game without a computer.
Right. Okay. And then I'd like to bring us back to another really interesting thing that I think for me that you said, which is this idea of how to capture the counterculture of the late 70s with this idea of achievement, this idea of being able to.
I don't think they captured it. I think it came from it.
Okay.
See, it's not marketing. And who knew? Maybe Greg Stafford and his buddies knew in Oakland because they were pretty much the most obvious note of this. A bunch of, slightly overeducated and, enthusiastically semi-mystic, people who liked they wanted to do novels, but they knew that breaking into novels wasn't going to work well. And they decided to do a board game. And then in their practice with the board game people, weird board game people hooked onto the proto role playing in whatever form. And then RuneQuest appeared. And these are very much the intellectual science fiction, fantasy, mythology people, hardcore mythology and anthropology people who, like to get high and they like to have a really, really good time. And they have a great sense of humor, and they love the idea of a fantasy world. And then they go and make RuneQuest. It's not that RuneQuest was made in order to go and find them.
No.
And so what you do now is you look around for people who are in some. Now, that book that I mentioned, Subculture, is actually very important because he distinguishes very sharply between subculture and counterculture.
Okay.
Subculture is when the activities, the marginalized activities, take expressive forms, whether music or clothing and stuff like that. And then they get captured and the subculture becomes a target market. That's what the book's about. And it focuses on punk, but it's not limited to it. And Hebdige distinguishes sharply between that and counterculture, which is we are doing things differently and we will not do it your way. We are not trying. There are not members among us who are trying to do it your way. We're just over here. And so the distinguishing is very important. What would have to happen is to bring the activity of role-playing into the sphere of the countercultural activity as it stands today. And people in it some would say, oh my goodness, I can express ourselves tremendously with this thing. And in ways that are distinctive to it, that are not the same as in other, particularly distinct from other fiction-oriented media. Role-playing has properties that no other fiction-oriented media has.
Right.
And these phenomena are poorly understood. I've done my best to dissect them out quite a bit in the last 5 years. And I think that they are extraordinarily powerful. Just to give an example of their power, one of the interesting things about those of us who are tagged with spectrum-y labelings and initials is that we're not supposed to be able to listen to one another well. We're not supposed to be able to tie into how other people feel or what they mean. We're supposed to not be able to concentrate. We're supposed to not be able to, or over concentrate, right? We concentrate to the point of solipsism, or we can't concentrate at all. All these things, right? Well, if you ever want to see a textbook example of multiple different spectrum positions, you just watch any one of my actual play recordings. And you'll see, it's like a fucking diagnosis across every single panel on that screen for of each person. And guess what we just did the whole time? We concentrated functionally, listened to each other, saw where each other was coming from, did pro-social, mutual support the whole time, right, and operated off of shared procedures and did all the things that we're not supposed to be able to do.
Compare that to any one of the episodes of one of the popular podcasts that are going around.
Right. Well, basically, you're going to see an amusing performance.
Yeah.
And so, whereas with us, you'll see us doing that very thing and displaying all of the characteristics of people who aren't supposed to be able to do that.
So just I want to tell you. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, no, that was just an example of one of the properties.
That's right. All. Okay, I see. I want to tell you my theory. Kind of, it's definitely building on what we've talked about today, but also the interviews that I did in the past, and also some of the text analysis that I've done on EN World, which is that this is this process that I'm trying to understand, the if we want to put it in your terms, the translation from a medium to a genre, from
there's the medium, and then there's idiom, which would be a set of topics and approaches inside the medium. But go on, yeah.
Which would be the set of the different systems, I imagine.
Yeah, the idioms. That would be part of the idiom, yeah.
Absolutely. But then translating it back so that the system, a particular system, is seen or understood as the medium. It's sort of become synonymous with it. To me, it has, in a sense, 3 pillars, I think. The first appeals to this kind of the symbolic value, which kind of ties back into the idea of fantasy, sci-fi, things like this. And this is propagated by media representations and sort of consolidated media representations about how this kind of thing should be done. The second is in the mechanics and the rules that are presented, which are intentionally limited to the point where you are forced to put yourself into the rules in order to tell the stories that you want to tell. And the third is the way that it goes from instead a mechanism of conformity to a mechanism of achievement, which is the open game license, which is a promise to say, using this, you can be a part of it and you can you can do anything you want with it. It's this sort of like this sense that you can self-actualize. So these 3 things together make it so that we have a system that is seen as a universal, and we all go back to it for the idea that we could tell our own stories, when in reality, we're just telling the same stories over and over again.
Now, do you think the OGL right now really has much in economic presence? Because when I was putting Sorcerer out and promoting it, 1999 and in 2000, in the sense of the game stores, because I wanted to do like just scratch my back and say, oh, look, I got in the game store.
Yeah.
And the one thing they said was, well, why isn't it D20? Why isn't it D20?
Yeah.
You should make it D20. 2-3 years later, when I was presenting more games and promoting them in that context, the one thing everybody said was, it's not D20, is it? Because the glut was over in a year. It was over in a year. It was done. It was quickly recognized that D20 was not the marketing gimme that they had been told it would be. And then the OGL took on its sort of odd identity as to do what the OSR people called retro clones, which is basically using, rewriting Menser or rewriting some, some particular TSR product, and saying, well, I can do that and they can't sue me, even though most of them were so derived that they didn't even need the OGL. But they wanted it because they wanted to be part of real D&D. So therefore, you have those usages of the OGL slash D20 first, and I don't think I've seen a D20 label on a game for 2 decades now.
No.
So
No.
that's
Yeah.
over. And then you have the OGL, but that also seems to have been this massive chimera more than anything else. In one of the videos that I recommended to you, a person asked me specifically, given your views on, Dungeons and Dragons as a folk religion, in which I'm not talking about playing it at all.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about it as a folk religion phenomenon, then how does that relate to the latest, this was a couple of years ago, all of the kerfuffle about Hasbro changing the OGL?
Sure.
Well, I told him exactly, what you might think I would tell him, which is that the whole thing is borked in the first place, and that Hasbro is done with your bullshit and doesn't need to please you anymore now that it's gotten under the Christmas trees. It doesn't need gamers anymore, so fuck off. Right?
No, that's exactly right.
And
I don't think that
and they can claim wine betrayal all they want to, but they're the ones who marginalize themselves. This is what you get when you do that.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I don't believe that the OGL directly has any economic benefit for the people who are using it, whether that's the Wizards of the Coast or the people who write things under it. There's one caveat, which is to say that while previously the internet might have been an opportunity to distribute games that were kind of like not following this trend, that itself has also been consolidated in the form of marketplaces like DM's Guild and D&D Beyond. What's valuable, though, to the OGL and to this whole system from Wizards of the Coast perspective, it's not exactly the kinds of thing. It's keeping people placated to say, like, you can put your creativity towards our thing, and it's promoting the game to new players, because who buys the books? It's not necessarily the people who have been making the games, the people who've been playing for 20 years, because they already have the books. You don't really need more than one. It's the new players. It's the people who are just getting into it. Those are the people that the
but are they really? But what are they getting into? Are they getting into play or not? Or are we basically siphoning off a legitimate human need to do this thing?
Yeah. Well, again,
siphoning it off into, are you basically taking the perfectly reasonable human urge to play sports, and siphoning it off into a very expensive, boutique, institutionalized, codified thing to do?
But it's exactly that. It's exactly that. You do not need a book to play soccer, let's say. You don't even need a ball. You just need a friend with a ball. Same thing with D&D. You need a friend with the book. So the books, the people that we really want, the people that are generating the most income for Wizards of the Coast are those people who want to play but can't. Because they're the ones who actually need to buy it and read it on their own and fantasize about how this could be and what they could do.
Well, the problem is, of course, is that if they try to use that book, then they even more so can't. And then they're going to buy the next edition, or they're going to buy the supplement, or they're going to go online and do other things that
or they're going to try and they're going to try and make their own addition to D&D, which just continues this whole sense that D&D is tabletop role-playing games. And
so it's really quite a there's a lot of this is related to nearly everything else that I've done. You could look at my ancient essays about the fantasy heartbreakers. You may or may not be familiar with my most notoriously despised move, which was to discuss the cognitive dissonance and, in fact, I think literal cognitive harm done to people who come in with the legitimate urge to do something called a story, by which I do not mean deliver a story, but rather to experience story creation. And then they run face first into your 90s text, which is all about how great it's going to be, and then everything you do is subordinated to the creative drive of one person at the table. And I referred to it as brain damage. I referred to it as
I looked into
harm. And I stand by that today. I've never apologized for it.
What we're seeing now is not necessarily running into the wall of one person at the table, but the idea of tabletop role-playing games by one corporation.
Which is kind of funny, because although the Blooms tried to do this, they never succeeded, and the Williams did try to do it, they never succeeded.
Yeah.
And Wizards of the Coast didn't even try to do it, right? They were basically there to pull, a financial flip.
Well, they may not have intended on doing it,
no,
but
but
they did.
I will point out that two things. One is that the 3.0 system, 3.0, 3.5 to Pathfinder, is not genuinely wretched, but it is very turgid. Right? It's a big wad of stuff to do that is going to be the same every time you do it.
Sometimes people use the word crunchy, I think. Is this
well,
what you're
no, that's not what I mean at all.
Okay.
That just simply means the amount of rules that you have to have points of contact with at any given time.
Sorry, so what do you mean by that?
No, what I mean is the impact of a decision made based on rules options. If it has very little impact, then you've gone to all this effort to, for not much to be done, for not much to happen.
Okay.
And so this can easily be turned, as it has been in Pathfinder. Basically, the players are busy. They are kept busy making decisions, paying earning and paying points, rolling dice, getting bonuses, calculating this. And it's not just the calculation. They could be acting and acting and acting and acting in character, acting. None of this has any impact on the situation of play at all.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean by turgid. It has this lump, this swollen thing that looks like it's filling the space, but actually it's just gas, or it's just porridge. There's no actual play really happening at all.
This is the dynamic that I think I'm observing here. And I really would recommend this book. If you haven't read it, it's called Burnout Society.
No.
Okay. And it describes essentially this sort of style of governance, that it's not so much.
Yeah, absolutely. No, in fact, although H.G. Wells' views on race were, if typical, fairly despicable, and if his views on the solution to the problem, I think, were hideously naive, he was absolutely right in critiquing what basically what we idealize as democracy as basically a bad thing that could only lead to war. And I think he was absolutely right in this. And the feeling of the people that he called the gray mass is exactly, I suspect, is very much what is being referred to as burnout. Although I haven't read the book, so I won't say until I read it. But I suspect there's going to be an overlap there.
Most likely, the way that you describe it, it's this. It's just the sense that the best way to keep people placated is to keep them busy. Right. And to keep them busy in a particular direction, as opposed to telling them what they can't do. We give them the sense of infinite possibility. It's exactly what the OGL does, essentially.
Yeah. So this is actually quite interesting to know about your research and where you're going with this. Would be absolutely fascinating, particularly because it's in a larger sense, it's quite depressing. However, from the standpoint of a practitioner, nobody tells me what to do. So in other words, if you're not, it's literally the influences and stuff that you're talking about are surprisingly helpless when you're not interested.
Well, you're right. You're right.
Completely.
I'm looking at these kinds of the pillars of this to say what is propping this up, but at the end of the day, what is propping it up is this, like, the feeling that you have to buy into the system. Like what you've said about how, you're just interested. If I don't mean to paraphrase, if I'm getting it wrong, please correct me. You're not interested. You're interested in supporting the people around you who are interested in the same things as you, I think as well, just as
voluntary outreach, which I don't have to do, but there is a degree of voluntary outreach that I really would like to keep
voluntary.
Right.
Yeah. But then also this sense that like you said, a musician doesn't need an instrument. They could play a song with a stick and a rock. You could do tabletop role playing with Well, you don't even need a table.
Well,
you
no,
know?
you don't need a table. And also there are, however, structural elements to the medium that you and I can discuss that are the
Sure.
medium has bounds, right?
We might
Yeah.
discuss that, but we're
Yeah.
not discussing that on behalf of everybody who's interested in playing tabletop role-playing games. We're discussing it on behalf of the game that we are, the experience that we're interested in having together, like
In
now.
terms of that's what we call the rules.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's
Or we would
different
refer
from a
to it
bunch of
as
stuff in the text. Now,
the
no, I'm
table.
not talking about the text. Yeah, we refer to it as the table. But if you
Yeah.
think about it, that's the rules.
Yeah. Yeah.
In any reasonable sense of the word rules. And the way that I
Mhm.
like to say it is, if you don't believe me, try breaking them sometime and see what
Sure.
happens.
So this
Yeah.
even extends, another thing that we haven't talked about is this idea of homebrew. I mean, this even extends to what the definition of homebrew is. You know, if you
All
look
play
at
is homebrew. All play
exactly,
is
yeah.
homebrew. Yeah.
And yet today, you know, I talk to more recent, more like newer players, and their idea of homebrew is anything that goes against the pre-made campaign that they're following, you know? So
Right.
it's
Right.
just interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Well, good. I think you've got some material, I hope, to work with.
Well, yeah, I do. Yeah, I know. I hate to cut this short, but I do. I mean, not really short. Let's be
Dude,
real.
we are long past your stated.
Long past short.
Let me just
Oh.
put it, I've already been wifed once.
Okay, we won't get to a second.
Yeah.
No, but this has been really fascinating. Thanks. Thank you for joining me today. Really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
And I've had a really good time and learned a lot actually from what you've been talking about to understand the nature of the analysis into these things as it
Oh, well,
exists.
I mean, that's fantastic. I also learned a lot, I have to say. My intuition was correct. You definitely have insight.
Oh no. All right. Well, great. Thank you for the compliment. And I will look forward if you want to talk to me again anytime.
Sure.
Please feel free.
Oh yeah,
for
no,
whatever
I'd love
reason.
to.
So,
And especially as this project kind of continues and formalizes, it'd be really great to chat with you about it in the future.
excellent. All right. Talk to you later on.
Yeah, talk to you later.